Good morning once again, students. My name is Mangaliso Mahlambi. I'm an admin officer for Counselling and Career Development Unit. I will be assisting with the technical support during the workshop. And I'm not alone. For the sake of time, I will just mention my colleagues who are with me now. We have Sibonelo Gumede, who's also an admin officer for Pietermaritzburg campus at Counselling Unit. And then we also have our interns. And then we have Inga Chekela, we have Beauty Maloba, Mobile Masugu, and Samgelisiwe Tusi, Nokbonga, Shange, and Sanelisiwe Dunge. And then we will assist you with the questions. As you have noticed that this is a live event, you cannot be able to unmute your mic or your cameras. So, however, feel free to use the Q&A and type your questions and concern there, and then we will assist where we can. However, the questions that are related to the presentation, Dr. Hendricks will attend to those questions at the end of her presentation. Without a waste of any time, Dr. Hendricks, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Program Director, for introductions to all the staff members in CCD, and good morning to our students, and welcome to our mental health workshop today, which is on anxiety. And I have titled it, Turn Your Worry and Fear into Your Superpower, because I feel that a lot of people get overwhelmed when they are suffering from anxiety. All of us have anxiety on a day-to-day basis. I think if we didn't have anxiety, we wouldn't be able to survive. If you think about our ancestors, how did they actually survive? How did they manage, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, how did they manage to hunt and survive? It's through the anxiety of being anxious around things like animals, for example, right? If we're not hypervigilant, if we're not aware, if we're not hyper-aroused, all those things are anxiety symptoms. We need those things in order to survive. Many of you would have heard about fight, flight, freeze. Those trauma responses or ways in which we respond to fear or threat of fear are things that keep us alive and keep the fear at bay, right? So the aims for today really is to enhance your understanding of anxiety, and also to look at some of the ways in which we can manage it. And there are some simple ways that you can manage anxiety. And when I speak about anxiety, I'm talking about the more generalized anxiety, because you will see from the presentation that some anxiety is so debilitating that it actually requires medical intervention or psychopharmacological intervention. And if you are somebody who suffers from anxiety, you would know what I'm speaking about. There's also something called high-functioning anxiety, right? And a lot of us have this high-functioning anxiety. And so we're going to explore that a little bit in the presentation. And then I want to impress upon you how our feelings, our thoughts, and behavior are all interlinked, and how these interact to produce common difficulties that just serve to perpetuate our anxiety, right? I also want to be able to impress upon you the importance of changing your thoughts so that you can help yourself to reduce the anxiety that you're experiencing. And then we're going to look at some of the strategies that you can use to manage your anxiety. For example, things like reappraisal, which is cognitive reappraisal and cognitive reframing, mindfulness breathing. And some of these you must have heard of already or may even have tried. We'll also look at the grounding techniques to help you navigate some of the challenges you might be experiencing with a lot more confidence, so that you can feel that you have the ability to cope and thrive, especially as we enter into a very important period, the exam period. I think a lot of people tend to become highly anxious about exam performance, about failure and things like that. And you'll see how your thought process about failure, for example, and what you've been fed from a very young age, things that you've internalized, how those things serve to perpetuate. For some of you, it may also trigger your anxiety. It may also be one of the causes of your anxiety. So what does normal and abnormal anxiety look like, right? Remember that normal anxiety and irrational fear are both emotional responses, and responses to stress or even perceived threats that we might be experiencing, but they do differ. And we know that they differ because they are, in terms of their intensity, in terms of their duration, and the rationality of the perceived threat. Normal anxiety is also a natural and often healthy emotion, and all of us experience it. But it occurs typically in response to any stressful situation. So for example, if someone is sick, if you're going through financial difficulties, if you're going through relationship issues, if you even doing a presentation like I'm doing today, I will have anxiety. It's normal, right? It's when it becomes disproportionate, like the way you react to something is disproportionate to the situation that you're facing. That's when it becomes problematic. Normal anxiety also helps us to in the way in which we react to our stress. So like I said earlier on, it's helpful to have a certain amount of anxiety because it helps us to cope better with the situation. But when an irrational fear is overwhelming and often disabling reaction happens, and this is then disproportionate to the actual threat that we are facing or the risk that we are facing. Excessive and abnormal anxiety. The excessive anxiety, this actually just refers to, for example, some of us are not general worriers. You get people that are just general worry wards. They worry about everything. But then you get people whose anxiety and their fear becomes irrational and excessive, and their worry is actually more persistent. They worry about every single day, every single thing, every single day. Right? And what happens is that it becomes abnormal because it starts interfering with your daily life. It affects, for instance, your schoolwork. It affects you, how you interact with people. Like you may not want to go out because you're worried about how other people might see you, what other people might think of you. What other people might say about you. It may affect your work or your academic, your studying. You may not be able to focus. You may not be able to concentrate. You may become forgetful because you're focusing so much on the worry of not knowing the work or not being able to pass the exam that you don't actually put in the time for the studying. And when that type of thing happens, we then say that you have an anxiety disorder, and it falls under obviously a group of psychiatric conditions. And anxiety disorders have many other disorders that I'll touch on just now. But people with the generalized anxiety, they tend to have a trouble concentrating or controlling their worries or their feelings of nervousness. And they often know that they worry much more than they should. They know this, but they can't turn it off. The worrying or the excessive fear that they experience is something that keeps them functioning in a way that's abnormal, but for them it feels normal. So anxiety, what actually is anxiety? It's a feeling, okay? It's something that we feel, it's an emotion, but an emotion of apprehension or fear or worry. Now, the source of this uneasiness is not always known or not always recognized, but we must also make clear in our minds the difference between anxiety and stress, and also from the differentiation from fear, in that the former is an emotional process, whereas fear is just generally cognitive, meaning that it's something that you think of, right? Whereas anxiety is something that you feel. So you must be very careful if there's somebody you know of, or even yourself, if you are somebody that has anxiety, telling somebody with anxiety to calm down doesn't work. It just makes the anxiety actually worse, right? Remember that also anxiety becomes abnormal when your feelings of worry, anxiety, or fear interfere with your everyday activities, like I said. Then only we look at more bigger kind of interventions like psychotherapy. We look at medical management, like with an anxiolytic, for example. Some of you might know things like Alzam, that people actually take to help calm them down, and they take this on a regular basis. The problem with a lot of the medications that you take is that they are quite, you become dependent on them, right? So like I said, it only becomes problematic. Anxiety becomes a disorder when it affects you academically, socially, and in terms of your work, right? Then we say, okay, this person is having abnormal anxiety. So what might cause anxiety to develop? Some of us learn to be anxious by watching other people be anxious. For example, if you grow up with an anxious mother, then, you are more likely to be anxious yourself, right? If your mother was somebody that was nervous and apprehensive and very fearful, you are likely to have followed and learned that by example. So you would have also learned from her reactions how to react to certain or similar situations. You may also become anxious or develop anxiety as a result of your own coping experiences. For other people, their life events trauma that they experience, whether, like I said, financial, relationship, sexual trauma, marital trauma, any of those, death and loss and so forth, can also cause you to become highly anxious. And remember, it affects any male and female, more females than males, but it can affect both adults as well as children as well. Children that are shouted at constantly, where there's loud noises in the house, where parents are fighting with each other. There's lots of screaming and swearing and, things being thrown at each other. A child becomes anxious from witnessing that, right? And so if you're a parent that screams and shouts, you need to make sure that you're not doing that in front of your children, because now you are growing a little anxious kid. The other thing is genetics, and we know with many mental health disorders, genetics plays a very important part. A lot of us can pass things like depression and anxiety on to others, or get it from our parents, our grandparents, and then also obviously temperament. Remember that anxiety is about an overestimation of danger and versus an underestimation of your resources that you have to cope. So let's look a little bit into some of the types of anxiety disorders. And I'm not going to go into all of the types, because I think what I want to generally just speak to is the generalized anxiety. I will touch on panic attacks, as I think that's a common thing among students, especially when it comes to exams, and you need to understand, how that affects you, especially when you're studying and when you are preparing for the exam. So it's normal to feel anxious from time to time. All of us feel anxious. You can feel anxious on your wedding day. You can feel anxious before you do a presentation, before you have to defend your thesis, for example. Anything that's stressful will make a person anxious, right? But excessive ongoing anxiety and worry that are difficult to control and interfere with your day-to-day activities will obviously make a psychologist or a doctor that you're seeing tell you that you have a generalized anxiety disorder. There are certain symptoms that you have to have in order to be diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder. And remember, I said, differentiate between normal anxiety, like, for example, situation specific, or are you somebody that just is anxious for anything and everything? It doesn't have to be a threat for you to be anxious. You just worry about things all the time, you overthink and so forth. Now, it's possible to develop generalized anxiety disorder as a child, as I said, or even as an adult. The symptoms are similar to panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and other types of generalized anxiety or anxiety conditions. But remember, each of these, whether it's OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or whether it's panic disorder with or without agoraphobia, there's PTSD, these are all different conditions. Some of the symptoms do overlap. And please don't get into the habit of self-diagnosing, right? Remember that living with generalized anxiety can be a long-term challenge for any person. It's not an easy disorder. And a lot of the time, people who have generalized anxiety also tend to have some other comorbid diagnosis, meaning they have some other condition as well. For example, they might have depression alongside this. Somebody who has been raped, for example, might have PTSD, but also will have anxiety around males, for example, or being in dark spaces. And so this often co-occurs with other illnesses. So what goes on in the mind of someone who's anxious? So there's different, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive and physical changes. Some of the emotional changes will be the person will be scared or panicky, or they might be completely tensed up all the time. They might have this keyed up on the edge kind of feeling of dread. They might also have this uncontrolled, irrational fear that the worst is going to happen. They may also become quite agitated, and so you can actually see somebody, physically see when they're anxious. You'll see them twisting their fingers. Their legs might be quite restless. They might look around. They might, physically you'll see the sweat on their faces. They'll look hot and bothered. But there are other symptoms as well that a person with anxiety may also have, like they may not eat really well, or they might eat too much, right? The comfort eating that we see sometimes. You might find that somebody with anxiety, because of all of the cognitive stuff that happens to them, like the overthinking that interferes with the ability to concentrate and focus and to have a good memory, then it affects their academic performance, which tends to decline. To cope with the anxiety, a lot of people think that drinking alcohol will calms them. It does for a little bit of time, but then after that has worn off, you'll find that the person actually is a lot worse off. They tend to have very poor sleep or sleep difficulties. They tend to also, like people with depression, tend to withdraw from their friends and things that they previously enjoyed. They may also have a lowered sex drive, and they will not enjoy things and become quite avoidant because they don't want to be a burden to other people. Remember, people that are anxious are very nervous, and they overthink everything, and they think the worst of every situation. Right? And you'll see when I come to the cognitive distortions, what I mean by what I've just said. So some of the symptoms of generalized anxiety, as I said, is that there's a persistent worry, right? Persistent means it's ongoing every single day. And it's about a number of different things that are happening, not just one. It's not just situation specific. It's like every single thing. They worry about money. They worry about their children. They worry about their partner. They worry about their work. They worry about their colleagues. They overthink all of these things, right? And they have anxiety around all of these things. And it's usually out of proportion to the impact of these events, right? They tend to overthink everything. So a large part of their time is spent on ruminating, like thinking about a conversation they've had with somebody. Or if they go for a job interview, they'll think, they'll overthink the whole interview process, what each interviewer said, what they said, how they responded. And then they make all these cognitive distortions in their mind about the interview, and they preempt think, right? So that's where the distorted thinking comes in. And then they also tend to perceive any and every situation as threatening, even if it isn't. They can't handle uncertainty, and they can become quite indecisive, or even have a dreaded fear of making a decision, okay, because they think they're going to make a wrong decision. And that's now tied in also with that distorted thinking and the overthinking. They can also have physically, they tend to be, people that are restless, agitated, fidgety. They internally experience this keyed up on edge feeling. You'll find that their hands may tremble, they'll start shaking. They may even say that they're very, very tired, that their muscles are paining, their muscles are tense. Occasionally, some of them will have irritability. But the cognitive problem here with them is that they often have difficulties concentrating, they're forgetful and unable to focus, or they'll tell you, my mind is blank. So when you speak to them, it's as if, especially when they're having an anxiety attack, they will look at you as if they're not in the same reality as you, as if they don't know what you are saying, or they may become temporarily forgetful, right? Other physical symptoms include, and you'll see the symptoms of generalized anxiety is similar, or there's an overlap between generalized anxiety disorder and panic attacks. And often people, like I said, when there's comorbidity, people with generalized anxiety will also have panic attacks or panic disorder. So other symptoms that are very kind of not very obvious, the person will have to tell you this, and they'll say, I'm feeling very nauseous, or they'll say, I'm feeling really dizzy. They tend to have an irregular heartbeat or heart palpitation. So they have what we call tachycardia or bradycardia, which is either very fast heartbeat or very slow, irregular. They may tremble and shake. Dry mouth is a common one. They will drink lots and lots of water. They may sweat a lot. And then there's also the shortness of breath. And they may also experience tummy trouble, and then complain about pins and needles. Now, you don't have to meet all of these criteria that I'm going to in order to be diagnosed with generalized anxiety, right? I think you need to have 5 of them only. But remember, it has to be, we focus on the intensity of it, and we focus on duration. You cannot have this once off within a particular situation and then say, oh, well, I think I have generalized anxiety. No, we look for a pattern of these kind of symptoms. So the other types of anxiety disorders that I spoke about was like your post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know this usually happens when somebody has a distressing event that they experience. Usually, I mean, PTSD came about when I think it was World War I or World War II, and they found that a lot of the combat victims were experiencing flashbacks and hyperarousal and hypervigilance. And that's how PTSD came about. But we can also experience this in things like hijackings and robberies, even an accident or a natural disaster where people experience flashbacks, they experience avoidance, and they experience hyperarousal and hypervigilance and so forth. Then we have our OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, which is also forms part of an anxiety disorder. Here is when a person has lots of ongoing, continuous, persistent, intrusive thoughts. For example, somebody might be anxious about germs, and we call them germophobes, but they tend to then engage in rituals or repetitive behavior in order to ward off that anxiety. So they'll excessive hand washing. It comes into play in order to ward off the anxiety or to bring down the level of anxiety, but that lasts only temporarily, and then you'll find they'll be busy obsessing about germs again, and then they're back at the sink washing their hands. There's other OCD type of behaviors as well. For example, people that have to have things aligned in a particular way. They can't have books out of proportion. Everything has to be stacked at a particular angle and so forth. Then panic disorder. Remember that a panic attack does not qualify as a panic disorder, but if you have several panic attacks, then you can qualify as somebody who is suffering from panic disorder. And usually this is intense and overwhelming and an uncontrollable feeling of anxiety, and it also comes with its own symptoms. And it's, like I said, there's a lot of overlap with the panic attacks. There's nausea, there's heart palpitations, and the heart palpitations actually sends people to the emergency room. This often, a panic attack is usually, you'll see people coming in and saying, I think I'm having a heart attack. And then doctors will do an ECG and find that there's nothing wrong, but it's because of the heart palpitations, either a very high heart rate, or the heart's beating very, very fast, or there's a shortness of breath because of the hyperventilating that the person's experiencing. They may also have excessive sweating, hands that tremble and shake. They also have that muscle tension. They also may complain about dizziness, mind going blank, or everything going blank. They may even faint. They may also complain about tingling sensation in the hands and feet. And this is the problem here is when students suffer from panic attack, when they worry excessively and they ruminate and cognitively distort things that give rise to or trigger a panic attack. And remember, a panic attack doesn't just come about. It can come from nowhere, but usually it has a trigger. And for students, my experience has shown me that usually, for example, around exam time, students will have a panic attack in the exam room or while they're writing the exams, because usually they're thinking about failing. They're thinking about, I haven't studied enough, I don't know my work, I'm not going to pass. And all of these thoughts amplify in the mind, and then that gives off, that results in them having a full-blown panic attack. But remember, if you are anxious, your mind will shut down, right? It cannot think for you at that moment. And that's why people say, my mind went blank, I couldn't remember a single thing in the exam. It's because you're highly anxious. And so when I go into the management of this presentation of anxiety disorder, I want you to pay close attention, because those are the things that are going to help you when you are in a similar situation, right? So, yeah, so if someone has, like I said, if somebody has one panic attack and it's once off, it may happen again, but if it doesn't happen again, it's just a panic attack, right? And it can happen again years later. You get some people, for example, when they've had a very tragic loss, they may hyperventilate, they may feel their heart beating fast and they're not able to breathe and so forth, and they may never ever have it again, right? But then you get some people who have persistent panic attacks and then qualify for panic disorder, and they obviously need therapy and they need medication. So what's high functioning anxiety? So high functioning anxiety, it's also a form of generalized anxiety, but it refers to people that experience anxiety, but they are high functioning, meaning it doesn't impact their work. They are able to do their daily tasks every single day. In fact, they manage it really, really well. It is a subset of generalized anxiety, but it usually, it goes unnoticed and it's not diagnosed as such. It's not even a diagnosable mental illness, right? Because the person is so high functioning. And they usually are people that are in top jobs. They have very successful careers, but what people don't know and don't understand is that they internally struggle with this persistent feeling of this stress and self-doubt, and they often are the people that have imposter syndrome, and they often feel like they don't measure up, that they're not good enough, right? They do appear like they're all put together, they're polished, they're really accomplished, got all a string of degrees and so forth, but they have this internal struggle and they worry. The internal struggle usually is the criticism of themselves. They do not feel that they're good enough, and they obsess about this particular aspect of their life, where they continuously put themselves down and belittle themselves, right? Now, people who are high functioning tend to be very, very busy. In fact, they have an excessive need for it. There are people that are highly organized. They are detailed oriented. They are high achievers, and they're people that are perfectionists. They strive for everything to be perfect, but they do have certain signs and symptoms that are often seen and paired with a particular kind of behaviors. So they're very controlling, and they want to stick, and they want others to stick to their strict routines and their strict habits. They often are hard to read and hard to relate to. They love working with to-do lists. They work extra hours. They'll volunteer for everything. They set very high expectations, and in fact, unrealistic expectations. But they can be very empathic, and there are, people that tend to follow rules. They're good citizens, but they're also good peacemakers as well. And as I said, they're high achievers. So, being detail-oriented, orderly, and tidy are things that are part of who they are. They can be very proactive, meaning that when a task is given to them, they tend to do it almost immediately. They plan ahead for all kinds of things. But all of this planning and detail-oriented mindset is about warding off the internal anxiety that they're feeling, because if they're not busy, then they have to give in to the anxiety. So in a way, people with high functioning anxiety, this is like a superpower for them. And I think this is the purpose of this particular title of the presentation, is to look at how, not to the point of being high functioning in that sense, but to look at how you can use your very mild anxiety, even if you have a generalized anxiety where you're on medication, to look at how you can use that to push you forward, to make you better at maybe managing yourself. If you're somebody that's disorganized, your anxiety makes you disorganized, look at how you can use your anxiety to make you more organized. So maybe you might want to put a to-do list into place so that it helps you to take the anxiety, your focus away from the anxiety, and you kind of project it onto your to-do list. So people with high functioning, they appear like yourself, me and you. They look very calm on the outside, very collected, and they look like they know exactly what they're doing. They're always smiling, laughing. They're very happy-go-lucky. They have this outgoing personality. They're the type that always arrive like half an hour before their appointments. They're very willing to help others, but to their own detriment. But often it's usually because they're so afraid of saying no. And they don't want to be seen as a bad friend or a bad spouse or a bad employee or colleague, right? So what is the underlying dynamics of somebody with a high functioning anxiety? Like I said, often it's because they need to people please, or they have this underlying need to please everyone, so they can't say no. And underlying that reason is their need for approval, and also because they don't feel that they're good enough. So they work harder to feel good enough, right? They plan more so that they can be good enough. Often they suffer from imposter syndrome, because that's where the self-criticism comes in, where they will say, I didn't do this presentation really well. It really went so badly. They will focus on all the things that went wrong and not the things that went right. They tend to have very poor boundaries, but often a lot of this comes from childhood and early childhood indoctrinations and internalizations from significant others, our caregivers, our teachers, and people we perceived as better than us, people whose opinions that we depend on and wanted to get approval from. They usually are the reason. That's the voice, that's the internal voice that's happening in your head, that you carry through with you from childhood, that makes you become somebody that has high functioning anxiety. So you constantly need reassurance from your partner or your colleagues. You're so afraid that you're going to let other people down. And you have the strongest fear of failure. And so these things drive you to be somebody that is, highly organized and detail-oriented and striving for perfection. So when is anxiety helpful and when is it harmful? Remember that anxiety only becomes a problem when our anxious feelings are overwhelming and it affects our performance in a negative way. It's also when it's so strong that it stops us from doing the things that we need to do, or it's so strong that we actually end up having panic attacks like I just spoke about just now. But remember that anxiety is short-lived. It can be short-lived, but it also, the other end of it is that if we continuously give into the thought process that we are engaging in, it becomes long-lasting, it becomes entrenched, and then obviously it affects other areas of your life, right? We find sometimes that we're worrying all the time, perhaps, about things that are a normal part of our daily lives. Or maybe we even worry about things that may not even happen. Or even worrying about worrying. A lot of people do that. They worry about worrying, and they don't really listen to what they're saying to themselves, other than to just say, you know what, I think I have so much of stress right now. And that's another thing. Try and define what your stress is about. Write it down, write out an action plan so that you can see, okay, what am I really having to worry about and what am I worrying about unnecessarily? When is it also harmful? Remember that I said feelings of anxiety are a normal response to any life changes that we might experience. For example, if you're going for a job interview, it's normal to feel apprehensive, to feel tense, to feel anxious, right? Or if you're going to do a presentation or just before your exam, it's normal, right? And remember, keep in mind that anxiety is a superpower, especially when we're in danger, okay? And the danger is real. But when there is no real danger and we think there is, and we become oversensitive to that, like an oversensitive smoke alarm. What happens is that if you're worrying all the time, your nervous system is not able to then distinguish between something that's real and something that's imagined. So that's why you find people with trauma, for example, or people with anxiety tend to be hypervigilant, hyper-aroused all the time because they don't know how to switch that part of their brain off, because their brain is so inclined to react the same in every situation, in a threatening and a non-threatening situation, right? With the certain techniques we do, we help you to put that anxiety in the past so that you don't react into your reality in the present the way you have been doing. Remember that I've said also that much of our anxiety is thought-driven, but it can lead to escalating and vicious cycles, especially when we don't understand it and we're not attuned to ourselves. And it often leads to avoidant behavior, and then that just leads to bigger problems for us. So now we're going to move into the, I think the next slide is on the management. Yeah, okay. All right, I just want you to take a breath. All right, just take a breath. I want us to look at how we're going to do the next part of our, what's our time? 1:45. All right. So I want us to look at rethinking anxiety, right? Because studies have shown that, when you're highly anxious, you tend to think differently about your anxiety symptoms, and that changes your response. So in other words, you think of it as your body's way of preparing you to meet a challenge. So for example, if your heart is beating faster, right? Think about it as, okay, my heart's beating faster. Don't think about I'm having a panic attack. It's getting more oxygen into my brain. I'm breathing rapidly right now because I'm excited. Not because I'm anxious, because I'm excited, right? Remember that an absence of anxiety also can interfere with your performance. So some people need that adrenaline, they need that anxiety to be able to push them to fight harder, to be better, to run faster, and so forth, right? And moderate levels of anxiety has shown to actually help us improve our performance in various aspects of our lives. It can actually be very adaptive. Because like I said, it helps us to deal with real danger. We need to be anxious. Imagine if you were somebody that had no anxiety. When there was a threatening situation that's confronting you, you wouldn't know, right? So it's the same like with our ancestors. If they didn't have an effective threat detection system, we as human beings would have been dead. All of us would have been dead by now. We would not have been able to survive. So not all anxiety is dangerous. Yes, I agree, it is unpleasant, but it's not harmful. In other words, you won't die from anxiety, right? Think of it as it's easier, it's trying to help me, right? And I'm going to show you ways in which you can turn. It's not just simply me saying or telling you to say that it's here to help me, but to look at how we're going to make this help you. Try to get more comfortable with your anxiety, meaning when it's happening, sit with it. It's okay, I'm feeling quite anxious right now. Some people even say, welcome anxiety, you're back. What can I do for you? And then you start calming your mind down and you start saying, okay, I'm going to have a panic attack just now because I can feel my hands are trembling. So you almost preempt it. My hands, you know yourself when you're having a panic attack. My hands are trembling. I'm going to have dry mouth. So let me get myself a glass of water. I'm also going to be sweating excessively and I'm going to feel tingling sensations in my hands. So you almost preempted. So when you have a panic attack the next time, write down all the symptoms that you've had so that when it happens a time after that again, you're almost wanting to preempt it. You're almost ready for it, right? So it doesn't take you by surprise. So learn about yourself because you can survive it and it will eventually surpass. It doesn't stay there forever. Even that panic attack takes 5 to 10 minutes at the most, some people longer. But it's a thought process that keeps you sustained in that panic attack, not necessarily the symptoms itself, right? So give yourself time and space, especially for somebody that's experiencing a panic attack. I think your brain needs to be made more conscious about its decision in terms of how it's going to respond. So when you're self-aware, you can make your brain, you can tell your brain, I'm feeling anxious right now. I can feel the anxiety happening. It's starting at my feet. It's working its way up to it's now in my knees. It's now in my tummy. It's a queasy feeling. I don't need to calm down, but I do need to breathe, right? And so also, the one place I like to start with, immediately when you're having a panic attack is the breathing part. But there's another part that you also need to work on later on, which is the thinking, because you need to understand how you get caught up in a vicious cycle of unhelpful thinking. Because the way we think, the way we feel affects the way we feel, and then obviously affects the action that we take or the behavior that we engage in, right? We develop patterns and of thoughts. For example, I would think that I'm going to fail my exam. What do? Then I don't attempt the work, right? Because I'm too afraid that I'm not, the volume of work is too much because I've told myself I'm not going to be able to get all of this work in and the exam is in a day's time or 2 days' time or tomorrow morning. And so that affects me, how I feel. I start feeling upset and angry or sad or frustrated or irritable. And then what does that do, right? I find myself not wanting to study. I find myself saying I'm going to go and sleep. Or for some people, even if they do attempt the work, they tell themselves they're not going to pass. What ends up happening? They go blank the next day because they've told themselves they don't know the work. So how the words that you feed yourself, the internal dialogue that you have with yourself is so important because it affects the behavior that follows. And all of these are interlinked. It's not a linear pattern. It's not that I have a thought first and then it follows a feeling. Sometimes you can have a feeling first that feeds into and amplifies a thought, which then affects your behavior, right? Let's just move on to distorted thinking. So remember I said earlier on that people who are anxious tend to have what we call overthinking or ruminate quite a bit about a specific thing. And I'm going to use exams as an example because that's often where we kind of intervene. Is that people who are anxious tend to think that they don't know their work, or they think they don't have enough time, or they think that they're not well prepared, or they may feed themselves something that they've heard before in the past from a parent who says, you're stupid, you're going to fail. So they start believing that I am a failure. So despite putting in a lot of time and a lot of effort and being prepared, what comes up for them? The past indoctrination, that internalized feeling of I'm not good enough, I'm not going to pass, right? So sometimes people get into different kinds of distorted thinking, right? Some of them are listed here like polarized thinking, which is your all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking. I'm either going to pass or I'm going to fail is an example of that. We also have catastrophization, which consists of two things, like people tend to magnify, meaning that they exaggerate things that they're not good at or didn't do well at, and then they minimize things that they actually are good at, right? Some people tend to overgeneralize. Another word for catastrophization is also forecasting. You know, when you forecast, you predict your future. You say something that hasn't happened yet. So you've written the exam, the results are not out yet, but you start worrying and saying, I'm going to fail. I don't write well. I'm going to actually fail, right? So let me just go on to that. On my right-hand side, you can see how to reframe your irrational thoughts. For example, if you have the irrational thought that I can't stand this, what cognitive distortion is this? It's catastrophizing. And a way to think better about this is to say, I'm having a hard time, but I can handle this. I've got this, right? Or, for example, if you say, I should have had my degree or diploma by now. The word should, ought, must are words that people with distorted thinking often utilize quite a bit. And a way of doing this in a different way is to say, it's okay that I don't have my degree yet, but I know that I can get my degree if I want to, right? Then another one is, for example, I feel worthless, which means also obviously that I am worthless. Now that's an emotional reasoning distortion. What you can say to yourself is, I often say thoughts are just thoughts, they're not the truth. But here they're saying feelings aren't facts. It's the same thing, right? Everyone has worth, and so do I. So there are different ways that you can cognitively reappraise and reframe some of the distortions that you have. Another way that I like helping clients is if they have any of these cognitive distortions you see here, like personalization, when you take things personally that are not meant for you, then you go home and you overthink it and you worry about it. And you think, what did they mean? What, was he saying it to me? Blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people with anxiety tend to personalize everything. I asked the person, okay, so what is the statement that you've come up with about yourself? That I'm a bad person, I'm ugly, I'm nasty, whatever the self-statement is. And usually it's a negative self-statement. And I say, okay, can you rate that statement for me in terms of how true you think it is? 0 being not true at all and 10 being very true. And they will say, well, I think it's an 8 or a 9. And I say, okay, fine, now I want you to go and find me evidence to support what you're saying. And when we meet again for the next session, you find that they say, Sharif, I spoke to so many people and I asked them about me and what their opinion was. And I realized people don't think I'm a failure. They don't think I'm stupid. And I said, then who thinks you're stupid? And I said, no, I'm thinking that. And I said, where does that come from? No, my own mind, right? But it also sometimes comes from past experiences, and then we'll deal with that more deeply. But often when we do what we call a thought record, I get you to identify automatic thoughts, which are usually negative in nature, usually have all of these cognitive distortions you see up on the screen, and then we rate it, and then we find evidence for it, and then we dispute it. Right. And then what happens is the person just discards that thought and they no longer think about that about themselves. So, okay, I've spoken to this slide about people using must, should, and ought. And people, with anxiety or panic attack tend to say, I should be doing this and I must do that when they describe themselves, in a situation. Like, for example, I must be calm on a plane, or, I must be a failure. But these are all just very harsh self-judgments, and they don't help reduce anxiety. They actually amplify the anxiety, right? Remember things like all or nothing thinking. This just leads to self-criticism, and it feeds your anxiety. It amplifies it. It maintains it. Exacerbates it, right? So try not to overgeneralize, right? When you think that you'll never be okay in public, or you'll always feel uneasy in public, or someone's going to see me having a panic attack. These are just very destructive thoughts, and they just add to your feelings of helplessness. So mind reading is just another one where you often, tend to think, what the other person is thinking. So you tend to mind read, and you think people are going to disapprove of you. And this just leads to more feelings of guilt and worry. Even if you don't have any proof that other people are evaluating you, you just think that people don't like you and they just have this aversion to you. You tend to just think you know what other people are saying. But when we ask you, where's the evidence for what you're saying, you often can't give us the evidence, and it's just really something that you've conjured up in your mind, right? And usually it comes from that whole personalization thing. So how do you manage irrational thoughts? Remember that if you choose to believe in an irrational thought, it can cause more anxiety and worry. So one of the things I often try and promote is to get you to become self-aware, especially about the conversation you're having with yourself, the internal dialogue, right? So, and you need to be able to stop those thoughts in its tracks, because if you don't stop them in its tracks, they're going to become beliefs, right? So like I said earlier on, you look for evidence to say, well, I don't believe what I've just said to myself right now. So identify some of the triggers, recognize the thoughts as and when they happen. And this can only happen when you become self-aware and self-attuned, right? And then identify and say, no, this is an irrational thought. There is no evidence for this. So actually some people, say, okay, I'm going to write it down. So they write it down and they say, okay, so how true is this that I'm saying to myself? No, but this is an irrational thought. So yeah, so try not to push the thoughts out of your head or even punish yourself for even having them. You don't want to argue with it either, right? You just notice it and say, okay, it's there. It's present in my head. Remember when you resist it, then it actually giving it more power, right? But don't let it disrupt what you're doing. Write it down, label it, and say, I'm going to come back to this. I don't know why I'm having this thought right now, but I'm having this thought. So I always say, catch it, check it, and label it, and then change it, right? Okay, so how do you do this? Catch it, check it, and change it. So know what you're looking for. Then this can only happen, remember, that if you are self-aware, right? Meaning self-aware means that you're consciously aware of your thought process. You're in tune with yourself. You're not, and you'll know how to be attuned with yourself if you start feeling a particular way. Remember I said thought, feeling, behavior. So when you start feeling sad, irritable, frustrated, you might go home, for example, and start shouting at your kids or shouting at your siblings or your partner. Backtrack. Okay, I was driving home in the taxi. I was driving myself in my car. And before that, I was having a conversation with so-and-so, and she said this, and then I got in my car, and then I started thinking. And then trace or track yourself. And then you came home and you started displacing on others. You were irritable and frustrated, so you took it out on everyone else. So know what you're looking for, but you can do this by tracking yourself, right? And then go back on that conversation and say, so-and-so was saying this to me. We were talking about this and that and that. And then I said this to myself, right? And then I concluded this. So that's unhelpful, right? It's an unhelpful thought. So check that thought. You can write it down, label it, and then reappraise it. That's how you change it, right? And we do this using a thought record. And really a thought record is about what is the thought, rating it out of 10 to be not true and very true, and then finding an alternate way, finding the evidence and then finding an alternate way to reframe that thought before it becomes a belief, right? I hope you got that. Now there's something called a worry tree, all right? I just need to drink some water. The worry tree, as you see up here, I like to say you must set aside worry time, right? Notice the worry. So sometimes it helps you to shift your focus to the here and now, all right? Ask yourself, what am I worrying about? Can I do something about it? Yes, I can. Then make a plan. What am I going to do? When I'm going to do it? How am I going to do it, right? If I can't do anything about it, just let it go. There's no point in focusing on it. Just change your attention to something else. It's called a distracting technique, right? You can also then say, okay, let me see whether I can catch it, check it, change it, right? Ask yourself, is this a worry I can do something about? Yes, I can do something about it. Yes, so how am I going to do it? Am I going to do it now or am I going to do it later? If I'm going to do it now, then I'm going to do it immediately. If I'm going to do it later, then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to schedule this for Friday afternoon, right? Once you've done it, let the worry go. Once you've scheduled it, let the worry go. There's no point in continuously worrying about something that you've already made a plan about how you're going to intervene in it, right? And then obviously you're wanting to then change your focus. It's important that maybe you write down how you're planning on doing it, so write out the action plan. And in that way, you're able to then let the worry go and you're able to change the focus. right? The 5x5 rule, this is something that won't matter in 5 years down the line, right? Ask yourself, if this is not going to worry me or bother me in 5 years' time, or 5 years down the line, I'm not going to bother wasting 5 more minutes obsessing about this, right? And then let it go. Because remember, if you're somebody who just worries about every single thing, this particular rule will apply to you. If you're somebody that worries excessively about a particular thing, maybe the worry tree might help you, so that you have to have a plan for each thing, right? But for me, I think I take from this kind of presentation things that I feel, okay, my anxiety is at this level. So maybe the 5x5 rule applies to me. If it's not going to matter to me in 5 years, I'm not going to waste more than 5 minutes thinking about it. Then you take that, right? But there are other techniques that are really helpful. For example, I like talking about the vagus nerve, right? Now, I'm putting 2 things together here. Something called TIP, which is temperature, which stands for temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and muscle relaxation, which is a dialectical behavior therapy kind of technique. So TIP works really, really well. And I'll tell you why, because it calms the vagus nerve, right? So the T is temperature. So what you can do there is, if you're feeling highly anxious, and this really works so well, I often say, go and have a cold shower. If you can't do the cold shower, because immediately brings your temperature down, and immediately you start feeling calmer. If you're not near a shower, and let's say you're at university or you're at work, you can't have a shower, so go to the wash basin and splash your face with cold water, and splash it until you know, when you're underwater in a pool, you're almost looking for your breath. You do that. You constantly throw the water on your face, and you find yourself almost doing this rapid breathing technique, and your vagus nerve then calms down. Because remember, your vagus nerve then calms down your heart and your brain, right? So the other nice thing about the TIP exercise is that it also tells us about intense exercise and how that helps us, but as well as breathing. Now, breathing is underestimated, especially for people with anxiety, right? When you breathe, what does it do? It reduces the oxygen demand on the heart muscle, right? And then your heart rate then drops. But what we need to do is not just your normal breathing. Like right now, we are sitting in this workshop. I've been talking. I'm not aware of my breath. When we do mindfulness breathing, we become aware of our breath, but we also do this deep and slow diaphragmatic breathing, from our bellies, right, with longer exhalations. And I use the 4-7-8 technique, okay? You can even use the 1-to-2 ratio. And then there's also the other one called the box breathing, which it's 4x4x4, which you exhale, you inhale for 4 seconds, you hold for 4 seconds, you exhale for 4 seconds, right? And then there's also coherence breathing. And coherence breathing is when you do 6 breaths per minute. So 5 in and 5 out, right? So I also teach people to breathe using an analogy, like, for example, if you were smelling a flower, so you will take a breath in with your nose, you'll smell that flower, and then when you're breathing out, you breathe out as one would do when you're blowing out birthday candles, right? Some people use breathing and they use a visualization exercise. So as you're breathing, you're imagining blue skies in with the breath and gray skies out with your breath, right? So yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different ways in which one can practice breathing, but just think to yourself, am I aware of my breath as I sit here listening to this presentation? And if you're not, just practice that slow breathing. In fact, maybe we should just do that in the session. We'll do that just now, but there's also something called humming meditation. So while you are meditating, you hum the tune of your favorite song, or a song that brings you a lot of calm, right? And if you do this on the regular, when you have an anxiety attack, or when you are having that persistent worry and fear, this will kind of come naturally to you, where you immediately default to humming breathing, or you default to your box breathing, right? Remember that mindfulness breathing takes a lot more, because you're wanting to be present in that moment without judgment, and you take a lot of you kind of couple it with progressive muscle relaxation, for example, right, which really helps to calm all parts of your body. Remember, when you calm, your vagus nerve is calm. When your vagus nerve is calm, because it's part of your nervous system, it's going to inform your brain, and your brain is going to inform your heart. What happens? Immediately, your heartbeat gets regular, and you stop the hyperventilating. I think let's do an exercise, right? Wherever you're sitting, I want you just to put your feet on the ground. And I want you to imagine something very pleasant to yourself. It can be a picture of your loved one, your baby, a beautiful holiday that you've been on recently, or a place you'd like to go visit if you haven't been on a holiday. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and turn down the volume, right? We know we're not going to get rid of the anxiety altogether, but we're going to at least learn how to turn it into a superpower by coping with it and not seeing it as the enemy, right? Anxiety is normal. We don't want too much of it. We don't want it too high. So what we're going to do is I want you to exhale for 4 seconds. Just blow out the breath. Blow out your breath for 4 seconds. And then I want you to breathe in through your nose for 4 seconds. And I want you to hold it for 7. And exhale for 8. And you do it again one more time. You'll do this a lot more times than I'm going to do here in the session. So breathe in through your nose, take in the breath for 4 seconds. Hold for 7. And exhale for 8. And I want you to actually hear the breath coming through your mouth. And the reason for that is because when you're having a panic attack, you often keep yourself in a state of panic because you believe you're dying. And the reason you believe you're dying is because you're thinking you're not breathing. But the moment you just go to breathing, I promise you, your heartbeat will start calming down. But you've got to do this mindfully, right? Because remember that when we breathe, what happens when we breathe? It activates part of our nervous system, that part that deals with the stress, that helps us decrease our heart rate, right? And the vagus nerve is the queen. It's the queen of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? It's the chilled out part of ourselves, right? So the more we do things that try and activate the nervous system, like, for example, the deep breathing that I was just showing to you now, then we're going to get rid of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, which is to make us anxious, right? Remember, the vagus nerve is like on the top of the ladder. When you become highly anxious, you're in the middle of the ladder. And all you're wanting to do to get to the top of the ladder, all you need to do to get back onto the top of the ladder is to breathe. 4, 7, 8. Remember those numbers, right? And in that way, you then calm your nervous system, right? Okay, exercise, I said, is part of the tip thing, the tip analogy that I gave you, the acronym that I gave you just now. Remember that when you exercise 2 or 3 times a week, we're able to de-stress, even if it's a walk for 30 minutes on the spot, around your lounge. If you don't have a safe space where you can actually go and exercise, try and do some kind of exercise. Some people will walk around their complex with their children, because remember, when you're bogged down with work, when you're highly stressed, exercise gets the endorphins moving. Right now, I'm not saying exercise 2 or 3 hours a week and it's too much for you. If you're somebody with knee problems, do what you can, but try and get out there, even in your garden. Just walk round and round in your room, maybe pace up and down, but just try and get in 15 to 20 minutes of at least, some kind of exercise, so that at least you can release those endorphins, right? You can also self-soothe through smell. Right? Some of us, for example, people who have experienced the loss of, let's say, a parent, and that parent on can give rise to a lot of anxiety, because you might feel that you're alone and you don't have a parent figure. What helps really calm people is to smell that person's favorite perfume, especially if that person was your sense of calm. or even smelling a favorite food that they may have made. It brings you a sense of calm because it makes your brain link the smell to them, and it immediately brings a sense of calm for you, right? Grounding technique, I know most of you might know about this. When you're having a panic attack, when you're feeling restless, keyed up, on edge, or anything that has to do with anxiety that makes you feel tense, find 5 things. If you're in the exam room, find 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel. Usually it's like, I can feel my pen. And you can rub your hand on your thigh. You can feel the ground beneath your feet. You can feel your feet within your shoe. 3 things you can hear: the birds outside, the car, or people talking outside. 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. This is called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. And what this does, it's a distracting technique. It helps you distract away from what's happening internally, i.e. the anxiety, right? Or it makes you distract yourself from what's making you feel anxious. So maybe you were focusing on something, the exam paper or the person giving out the exam paper, and it starts making you feel anxious. Don't focus on the person giving out the exam paper. Just start focusing on, what can I see, what can I feel, what can I hear, what can I smell, and what can I taste, right? This is a bit of a long one. Remember that we can turn our anxiety. I'm going to move from this one here. Okay, maybe let me just touch on how we can create a list of positive messages that would motivate us towards our goal. So if you're afraid about writing an exam that you have failed before, you can shift your focus and ask yourself, why do I want to write this exam? Instead of saying, oh, I got this exam to write. Why? Because I want to complete my degree. I want to graduate. I want to find a job. So focus on something more positive, right? What is this, writing this exam? What does it symbolize to me? If driving is a fear for you, ask yourself, okay, why do I want to drive? Okay, I want to drive because I need to drop my children off at school, or I need to get myself to work, or I need to go buy a present for a loved one, and so forth, right? When it threatens to keep you from people you love and the activities you enjoy, these steps can give you powerful motivation to do what is meaningful in spite of your anxiety. So don't focus so much on the anxiety, right? Remember I said earlier on, also, if you tell somebody to calm down, somebody who's anxious, and you tell them to calm down, it's not a good thing, right? Because they're anxious, they're feeling stressed. They're not helped by you saying that, because what does that say to them? You don't see my anxiety, you're dismissing my anxiety, you are dismissing and invalidating my experience. So just let them sit with their thoughts, maybe rub their back, hold their hand, and just ask them to breathe would be a better way. Ask them to wash their face with cold water. Ask them to take a walk with you, right? You can also reappraise your anxiety, right? Ask yourself, what benefits does having this anxiety have for me right now? Does it help me to get things done? Remember, I said people with high functioning anxiety, they get lots of things done. Does it help me to focus? Does it energize me? Does it help me to work harder? What purpose does this anxiety have for me? Then reappraise it and ask yourself, what can I do with this anxious feeling right now? And I'm not talking about somebody who's having a panic attack, right? Keep that in mind. I'm talking about somebody who's just having a tensed and anxious feeling right now about writing the exam. People who have a clinical anxiety, people who are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, you can take some of this with you. And we do a lot of this in our therapy. And some of you might say, but this is not going to work for me. I need to pop an Ativan. If that works for you in that very moment, then pop the Ativan. But remember also, Ativan is highly, not contagious. It's you become dependent on it, right? And so it's a benzodiazepine. It's a short-term solution. This is intended to help you to cope better with your anxiety, right? So it works alongside your medication. For those of you who have a very mild anxiety, you can also use these techniques as well to help you cope better and manage better to a point where you're no longer having these anxiety thoughts and feelings, right? You can also reframe your thoughts. This is called cognitive reframing, and redirect your energy and focus that comes from worrying to actually problem solving. Right? So that's how you turn your worry into a superpower. Remember the worry tree? You identify it, you label it, you say, okay, what's the action plan? Because worrying about something is not going to resolve it. It's just going to keep you stuck in the worry state. Remember, I said also try and rate the thoughts that you're having about whatever it is that you are facing that's causing you the anxiety. Find the evidence. If it's not true, then discard it. And you have to have substantive evidence to be able to support your anxious feelings and thoughts. So when we're anxious, when we consciously decide how we're going to respond, we then start using anxiety as a tool, a positive tool to then supercharge our brain, right? And in this way, remember what you feed yourself. What if you feed yourself that my anxiety is bad, my anxiety is debilitating, my anxiety is going to be the end of me, that's how you wiring your brain. But if you choose to be positive about your anxiety and say, okay, so I'm having this anxiety, I can do breathing, I can do the grounding technique, I can look at the worry tree, I can look at my thoughts, go into myself and become self-aware, I can rate it, I can look for the evidence for it. You can say, I am in control of my anxiety. A lot of the time, people with anxiety feel they don't have any control over anything, right? But when you start cognitively reframing and reappraising a situation, that it's not as bad as I think it is, there are things I can do about this. I can call people in to help me. I can rely on my mom or my dad or my partner. I don't have to take all of this on for myself. If you're somebody that worries naturally and you know exam period is a time for you that you become extremely anxious, prepare well in advance and keep on saying to yourself, I am prepared. I have prepared really well, as opposed to telling yourself, I'm not prepared. You have to counteract and reappraise and reframe that thought, right? In that way, a more positive and neural pathway is established in your brain. You can also turn all these what ifs that you have in your brain. What if I fail? What if I don't remember all my work that I studied? Put that down into a to-do list, right? Now what you're doing is you're turning that anxiety into action. You are saying, I've got 15 chapters to do. I know 9 of the chapters. I still have 6 more of the chapters. How am I going to do these 6 chapters in 2 days? And then put, okay, I'm going to do 3 chapters on day 1 and another 3 on day 2. I'm going to leave a little bit of the time for my revision. So when you take mental action, it actually helps to decrease your anxiety and then increases your productivity, right? You can use anxiety as a catalyst, right? And by reframing it from being a problem to bring a lesson, something that I often talk about this in my mindset, my growth mindset, fixed mindset workshop, right? So what you're wanting to do is develop an activist mindset. You learn how to hear the voice of the fixed mindset. It says, you have a limit to what you can achieve, right? Remember what growth mindset says. You have to put in the effort in order to be able to get what you want, right? Consciously recognize that you actually do have a choice. You can either listen to the self-limiting belief in your own power or listen to your growth mindset voice. This is the one that says that you have control over your own stress response, right? Try to do, be active about it. Be somebody that listens to yourself, listens to your feelings, listens to your thoughts, and then talk back to that negative self-limiting voice that you hear in your head, and talk back to it with a positive growth mindset voice, right? So instead of saying, I'll never get through this, I can't imagine doing this anymore, try and say, this situation, this exam, this loss, this marital situation, this partner problem is such a stressful situation right now, but I know it's going to pass. I'm not always going to feel this way. I know that I can do A, B, and C. I can talk to A, B, and C, or X, Y, Z. And I know that's going to make me feel better. It's going to make me feel more grounded. It's going to make me feel more in control, right? Now, remember, each of these strategies can be helpful because each of them give you a different way to highlight what's meaningful in your life. And I ask, why is this important? Because it shifts your relationship with anxiety away from the fear and the worry. And we've come to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for staying. I'm going to open the floor now to Q&A. This is our contact info, where you can contact us to book a session with a student counselor. You can see the QR code there that takes you straight to our booking app. And then, of course, the email address there will take you to emailing our admins. And then you can also call us should you want to make an appointment or just get telephonic counseling.